Hey guys, tonight we're going to explore a question that history quietly holds. Where did the people who built homes along the mountains in ancient America go? Before you settle in, take a moment, turn off the lights, and simply listen. Enjoy the story as it unfolds, slowly, carefully, like history itself. The ancestral Puebloans who vanished. For a long time, the land of the American Southwest was quiet. Not empty, just quiet. Long before highways, before borders, before the idea of the United States even existed, people lived here, slowly, patiently, and without writing anything down. They did not leave books. They did not carve long explanations. They did not tell us their names. What they left behind were walls. Stone walls, cliff walls, entire villages built into rock. Today, we call these people the Ancestral Puebloans. They are also sometimes called the Anasazi, a name given much later by others, not by themselves. They lived in what is now Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, and then they disappeared. Not suddenly, not violently, just quietly. No clear records, no final message, no single reason, only abandoned homes. Archaeologists believe the ancestral Puebloans began settling this region more than 2,000 years ago. At first, they lived simply, small family homes, basic farming, corn, beans, squash. They learned how to survive in a harsh place where water was rare and the seasons were unforgiving. Over generations, they improved. Their houses became stronger. Their communities became larger. Their knowledge of the land became precise. They understood rainfall patterns. They tracked the sun. They planned harvests carefully. Nothing about their life suggests haste. Everything suggests patience. By around 700 AD, something changed. Their villages began to grow. Stone replaced mud. Small homes turned into connected rooms. Communities began stacking upward instead of spreading outward. They built structures that still confuse modern builders. Multi-story homes, perfectly fitted stones, no mortar in some places, yet the walls still stand. And they built them inside cliffs. Not caves they found, caves they created. Cliff dwellings were not easy to build. Each stone had to be carried by hand, each beam cut, shaped, and lifted. Every room planned in advance. This was not the work of desperate people. This was organized, intentional, quietly impressive. One of the most famous places they built was Mesa Verde. Here, entire villages were carved into canyon walls, rooms, storage spaces, ceremonial chambers called kivas. These were not temporary shelters. People lived here for generations. Children grew up here. Elders died here. Life continued. Slowly. What makes this strange is not how they lived, it is how carefully they lived. The ancestral Puebloans wasted very little. They reused materials. They repaired instead of rebuilding. They stored food for bad years. They were not careless with the land, which makes what happened later harder to explain. By 1100 AD, the region was crowded. Villages were closer together. Resources were more limited. Rainfall became less predictable. Tree ring data shows long periods of drought. Not dramatic disasters, just years that were slightly worse than usual. And then, slightly worse again. Slow pressure, the kind that builds quietly. Still, the people stayed. They adjusted farming methods. They expanded storage. They adapted. There is no evidence of panic, no evidence of mass violence, no evidence of a sudden collapse. Just gradual change. Then, sometime in the late 1200s, something happened. Villages were abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned, just left behind. Cooking tools still inside, personal items still present, walls still standing. People walked away and did not come back. By 1300 AD, Most major ancestral Puebloan cliff dwellings were empty. The land returned to silence. Wind moved through doorways. Sand covered floors. Time took over. The people were gone. Where did they go? That question has no single answer. Some likely moved south. Some joined other Pueblo groups. Some adapted and changed names. But the large organized cliff-dwelling society never returned. It ended without an ending. What remains today is not a mystery filled with drama. It is a quiet mystery, one where people lived carefully, planned thoughtfully, and then chose to leave. Not because of one disaster, but because staying no longer made sense. This was not the fall of a civilization. It was a decision, a slow one, a boring one, and perhaps the most human kind.
Part 2. Why they chose the cliffs. The cliffs were not an accident. The ancestral Puebloans did not wake up one day and decide to live inside rock walls without reason. Cliff dwellings were not a mistake. They were not a last resort. They were a choice. And like most choices made by careful people, this one had several quiet reasons behind it. Before the cliffs, the ancestral Puebloans lived on open land. They built homes on mesa tops and valley floors. These villages were easier to reach, easier to expand, easier to farm around. For centuries, this worked. But open land comes with exposure to weather, to strangers, to uncertainty. The American Southwest was never gentle. Summer heat was relentless, winters were cold and dry, rain was unpredictable. On flat land, houses absorbed heat during the day and lost it quickly at night. In cliffs, stone did something different. It protected. Cliff walls regulated temperature naturally. During the day, rock absorbed heat slowly. At night, it released warmth gradually. This created a stable environment, not comfortable, just survivable. And in harsh environments, survivable is enough. Water mattered more than comfort. Many cliff dwellings were built near natural seeps, tiny water sources that formed where groundwater met stone. They were not rivers, they were not streams, just enough. Enough to drink, enough to cook, enough to live. From the outside, cliff homes looked dangerous. Steep access points, narrow paths, long drops. From the inside, they were controlled. Few entry points, clear sight lines, natural barriers. This suggests something important. The ancestral Puebloans were thinking about defense. There is evidence of tension during this period. Not constant war, not chaos, but pressure. Growing populations meant villages were closer together. Resources were shared or competed for. Cliffs offered distance, not isolation, but separation. Defense did not require fighting, it required discouragement. A hard-to-reach home is often enough to prevent conflict. If approaching is difficult, most people choose not to try. Cliff dwellings made that decision easy. Still, the cliffs were inconvenient. Daily life required effort. Food had to be carried upward, water hauled carefully, children guided along narrow ledges. This was not an easy lifestyle, which means it was chosen deliberately. Community planning mattered. Cliff villages were not random. Rooms were grouped, kivas were placed centrally, storage areas were protected. Every space had a purpose, nothing was wasted. Kivas deserve special attention. They were circular ceremonial rooms, usually built partially underground, even in cliff dwellings. This required extra effort, digging into stone, reinforcing walls, planning ventilation. They did this anyway, because ritual mattered. Life was not only survival, it included belief. Seasonal ceremonies, agricultural rituals, community gatherings. The cliffs did not stop this, they adapted it. Sound behaved differently inside canyons. Voices carried, drums echoed. Ceremonies felt enclosed, more focused, more private. Privacy mattered, not from the world, from distraction. The cliffs narrowed life down to essentials: food, family, ritual, time. But cliffs also limited growth. There was only so much space. Villages could not expand endlessly. This forced decisions: who stayed, who left, who moved elsewhere. Cliff life required balance. The ancestral Puebloans understood limits. They planned for them. But limits do not disappear, they only wait. By the time cliff dwellings became common, the region was under strain. Rainfall patterns were changing, soil quality was declining, wood sources were farther away. Life became heavier. Not impossible, just heavier. Still, the people stayed, for generations, which tells us something important. The cliffs were not fear-driven, they were stability-driven. Eventually, even stability became fragile. The cliffs could protect from enemies, they could moderate temperature, they could provide shelter, but they could not create rain, they could not grow crops, they could not reverse drought. The cliffs delayed a decision, they did not prevent it. When people finally left, they did not leave because cliffs failed. They left because the land itself could no longer support the life they had built. The cliffs had done their job for a long time. The question is not why they chose the cliffs. The question is why they stayed so long, and why when they finally left, they never returned.
Part 3. How they farmed where almost nothing grows. The land where the ancestral Puebloans lived was never meant to be generous. Rain arrived late or not at all. Summers were long and dry. Winters were short but unforgiving. Soil was thin, rocky, and easily exhausted. And yet people farmed here for centuries without destroying the land completely. This was not luck, it was method. The ancestral Puebloans did not fight the environment, they observed it. Over generations, they learned where water moved after rainfall, how long moisture stayed in the soil, and which slopes received just enough sun without drying out too quickly. Farming was not based on speed or abundance, it was based on patience. Corn was the center of their agricultural system. Not the tall, modern corn seen today, but smaller, hardy varieties that could survive long dry periods. Corn was planted deeply, where moisture stayed longer. Fields were not large or continuous, they were broken into small plots, spread across different elevations and microclimates. If one field failed, another might survive. Beans and squash completed what is often called the Three Sisters system. Beans restored nitrogen to the soil. Squash covered the ground, reducing evaporation and preventing weeds. Together, these crops created a balance that allowed repeated planting without complete soil collapse. This system did not maximize yield, it minimized failure. Water was never wasted. The ancestral Puebloans built small check dams across shallow washes. When rain came, these barriers slowed runoff, allowing water to soak into the soil instead of disappearing downstream. Over time, sediment collected behind the dams, creating deeper, more fertile planting areas. These structures were simple, easily repaired, and intentionally temporary. When one failed, another could be built. They also practiced runoff farming. Fields were placed below rocky slopes where rain naturally flowed. Even brief storms could provide enough moisture if captured correctly. Farming here was less about irrigation and more about interception. They did not bring water to the crops, they brought crops to the water's path. Storage was just as important as planting. The ancestral Puebloans built secure granaries, often high above ground or hidden within cliff dwellings. Corn was dried carefully and stored in sealed containers. These reserves were not for trade or surplus wealth, they were insurance. Years of good harvests were saved to survive bad ones. Tree ring studies show that droughts were common. Some lasted several years. During these periods, food consumption likely became strict and measured. There is little evidence of mass starvation, suggesting that storage and rationing were effective. Life continued, but slowly. Farming was tied closely to observation of the sky. Solstices and equinoxes mattered. Sunlight angles were tracked using natural markers on stone and cliff faces. These were not abstract rituals, they were calendars. Knowing when to plant or wait could mean the difference between survival and failure. Despite all of this planning, farming remained fragile. Soil slowly degraded. Wood for tools and fuel became harder to find. Fields had to be placed farther from homes. Carrying food back to cliff dwellings became more demanding with each generation. What had once been manageable became exhausting. Still, the people adapted. They reduced field size, they diversified locations, they likely traded with neighboring groups to supplement food shortages. This was not a society unaware of decline, it was a society constantly adjusting to it. What they could not control was time. Long-term drought in the late 1200s strained every system they had built. Storage ran out faster, recovery periods shortened, margins disappeared. Farming did not suddenly fail, it slowly stopped being enough. At some point, the balance tipped. The effort required to maintain fields exceeded the benefit they provided. When that happens, a choice must be made: adapt further or move on. The ancestral Puebloans chose movement, not in panic, not at all once. Families likely left first, then communities. Fields were abandoned before homes. Tools were taken. Structures were left intact. Farming ended not with collapse, but with quiet resignation. They had pushed the land as far as it would go without breaking it completely. When it could give no more, they did not force it. They walked away. This was not agricultural failure, it was agricultural realism.
Part 4. Daily life inside the cliff dwellings. Life inside the cliff dwellings followed a rhythm that rarely changed. There were no clocks, no written schedules, and no clear separation between work and rest. Time was measured through light, shadow, and routine. When the sun reached certain points on the canyon wall, people knew what part of the day had arrived. Morning began early, not out of discipline, but out of necessity. Light mattered, warmth mattered, everything depended on them. Homes were small. Rooms were often just large enough for sleeping, storage, or simple tasks. There was no excess space. Walls were thick, built from carefully shaped stone fitted tightly together. In some places, mud mortar was used. In others, stone alone held the structure together. These walls insulated against heat and cold, but they also trapped smoke. Fire was essential, yet dangerous. Ventilation was limited, so cooking was often done outside or near openings. Families lived close together. Privacy was minimal, but familiarity was constant. Sounds traveled easily through stone corridors. Conversations, footsteps, and daily work blended into a steady background presence. Silence was rare during the day. At night, it returned slowly, broken only by wind and the occasional movement of animals below the cliffs. Food preparation took much of the day. Corn was ground by hand using stone tools. This process was slow and physically demanding. Grinding stones found in dwellings show signs of long-term use, worn smooth by years of repetition. Meals were simple: corn-based dishes, beans, squash, and whatever wild foods could be gathered nearby. Meat was limited. Hunting was possible, but not frequent enough to be relied upon. Children learned by watching. There were no formal lessons. Skills were passed down through demonstration and repetition. A child learned to grind corn by doing it, learned to carry water by carrying it, learned the danger of cliffs not through warning, but through careful guidance. Falls were rare, not because the environment was safe, but because people grew up understanding it. Water shaped daily movement. Fetching it required planning. Some sources were far below the dwellings. Each trip down and back up took time and energy. Containers were carefully handled. Spills mattered. Water was never treated casually. During dry periods, its use was tightly controlled. Kivas played a central role in community life. These circular spaces were used for gatherings, rituals, and decision-making. Entered through the roof by ladder, kivas symbolized separation from ordinary life. Inside, discussions happened quietly. Rituals followed strict patterns. These were not places of spectacle, they were places of continuity. Belief was woven into routine. Ceremonies marked seasonal changes, agricultural cycles, and communal responsibilities. These events were not frequent interruptions, they were expected parts of life. Participation mattered more than understanding. Meaning came through repetition rather than explanation. Despite the difficulty of life, there's little evidence of constant fear or disorder. Tools were maintained, homes were repaired, paths were kept usable. This suggests stability. People were not merely surviving, they were maintaining a system that worked, at least for a time. Evenings were slower. Light faded quickly inside the cliffs. Activities narrowed. Stories were likely told, though none were recorded. Knowledge was oral, fragile, and dependent on memory. When people eventually left, much of this knowledge left with them. The cliff dwellings were not silent places of isolation. They were active, connected communities. People traded, visited neighboring groups, and maintained social ties beyond the canyon walls. The cliffs did not cut them off from the world, they simply framed it more tightly. Over generations, the effort required to live this way increased. Repairs became more frequent, resources came from farther away, tasks took longer. Life did not collapse, it slowed. The routine that once felt stable became heavy. When families began to leave, daily life changed gradually. Some rooms were no longer used, some paths saw less traffic, fires burned less often. Abandonment did not happen in a single moment, it unfolded quietly, like everything else. The final days of life in the cliffs were likely unremarkable. People packed what they needed. They did not destroy what they left behind. There was no reason to. They expected someone might return. Or perhaps they simply did not believe in final endings. What remains today are spaces shaped by ordinary days, not by kings or wars, but by repetition. The cliff dwellings are not monuments to greatness, they are records of routine. And that is what makes them difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. Part 5. Beliefs, Rituals, and the Meaning of the Kiva. Life inside the cliff dwellings was guided as much by belief as by necessity. Every action, every routine had layers of meaning beyond survival. The kiva, a circular, often subterranean room, was at the heart of this structure. It was not just a room, it was a lens through which people saw their place in the world, their connection to the land, the sky, and each other. It anchored both the practical and the spiritual aspects of life. Kivas were entered through a ladder from a small roof hatch. This entry alone carried significance. To descend was to leave the ordinary world behind. The room's circular walls enclosed those inside, isolating them from the wind, the sun, and the noise of the cliffs above. Here, discussions, ceremonies, and rituals were conducted in a quiet, deliberate manner. Voices carried differently, echoing softly against the stone, amplifying speech in subtle ways that made every word more deliberate. Even without writing, communication was amplified through design. The construction of a kiva required patience. Stones had to be gathered and shaped carefully, walls were reinforced to withstand both time and the elements. Ventilation shafts were planned with precision, ensuring that smoke from small fires inside could leave without suffocating participants. Floors were leveled, sometimes with a slight depression in the center for ceremonial purposes. This attention to detail suggests that the purpose of the kiva was as much about creating a controlled, intentional space as it was about performing any particular ritual. Daily life and ritual were intertwined. Ceremonies often corresponded with the seasons, marking planting and harvest times. They reminded people that their survival depended not only on their labor, but also on patterns they could observe but not control. Sun, moon, rain, and wind were all elements of a system in which humans were participants, not masters. Participation in these rituals reinforced social cohesion, teaching children their responsibilities and linking families to one another through shared experience. Rituals were not theatrical, they were not meant for spectacle. There was no audience beyond the participants. The quiet, deliberate repetition of actions conveyed meaning, not display. Sitting in a kiva, performing a task exactly as it had been done by elders, connected a person to generations past. Knowledge was passed in gestures, timing, and subtle cues, rather than written words.
Belief also informed practical decisions. When to plant crops, when to store food, and when to repair dwellings was guided as much by observed signs as by oral instruction. Ritual acted as a framework for daily survival, ensuring that tasks were completed at the right moment. In a harsh landscape, timing was as critical as skill. Children observed and participated from a young age. Learning came through doing, through watching elders perform precise actions, through understanding the rhythm of the seasons. Discipline was not imposed by force, it was instilled through expectation, repetition, and observation. Mistakes had consequences, but they were mostly measured by survival rather than punishment. This system encouraged independence, attentiveness, and respect for the environment and community. Social hierarchy existed, but it was subtle. Certain individuals might lead ceremonies, maintain records of seasonal cycles, or guide work in the fields. Influence was practical rather than political. Authority derived from knowledge, skill, and experience rather than coercion. In this way, life remained relatively stable even under environmental pressure. The kiva also served as a communal anchor. It connected people emotionally and practically. Decisions about resource allocation, work assignments, and conflict resolution often took place there. Inside the circular walls, the community gathered to maintain cohesion. The design of the kiva, its placement, and the care given to it demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of how space influences behavior and relationships. Over decades and centuries, these rituals and beliefs created continuity. Even when environmental stress increased, when droughts persisted or crops failed, the social structure remained. Ritual provided predictability, a rhythm that countered uncertainty. Work, life, and belief became inseparable in the daily patterns of the ancestral Puebloans. Yet, despite careful planning, rituals alone could not prevent decline. When resources dwindled and the effort to maintain dwellings, fields, and water systems exceeded the benefit, the community faced a choice. They could continue hoping for recovery, or they could leave. When the decision came, it was not sudden or violent, it was deliberate. The kivas remained, empty of ceremony, silent witnesses to departure. The rituals ceased not because they failed, but because there was no longer a practical audience. The empty kivas left behind are powerful reminders. They tell a story of people who lived with patience, who measured their actions carefully, who valued community and rhythm over haste and conquest. They also hint at the limits of even the most disciplined human systems when faced with environmental pressure. Belief sustained life for centuries, but it could not override the realities of drought, soil exhaustion, and logistical strain. When modern observers enter these spaces, the first impression is silence, yet beneath that silence lies a history of repeated effort, quiet ritual, and thoughtful design. The kivas, the rooms, the dwellings themselves are not monuments to greatness or heroism. They are monuments to consistency, patience, and human adaptation. In these spaces, we can understand life that was deliberate, slow, and careful, the very essence of what would come to be remembered as the boring history of people who simply survived, planned, and lived in rhythm with a difficult land.
Part 6. Signs of Strain and Early Departure from the Cliffs. By the late 1200s, small changes in the environment began to accumulate into noticeable stress. Rainfall, which had always been unpredictable, grew even more inconsistent. Some years brought enough water to support crops, but others brought almost nothing. Soil quality slowly declined. Areas that had been fertile for generations no longer produced reliable harvests. Wood for fuel and construction had to be collected from increasingly distant locations, forcing people to expend more energy just to maintain their homes. What had once been a manageable life became heavier, more demanding, and increasingly uncertain. The ancestral Puebloans responded the way they always had, carefully, deliberately, and incrementally. Crops were moved to more favorable microclimates. Terraces were reinforced. Storage practices became stricter. Granaries were checked more often. Families planned their days with an even greater awareness of risk. Children observed these changes, learning that life had grown more difficult, but that it could still be managed. There was no panic, there was only a slow tightening of routines. Yet even the most careful routines cannot stop the passage of time or the limits of a fragile landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests that around this period, some households began to leave the cliffs before others. They did not abandon the entire village at once. Instead, small groups departed, possibly seeking better land, better water sources, or alliances with neighboring communities. These early departures were not marked by destruction or conflict. They were quiet, deliberate, and cautious. People packed essentials, leaving behind what was unnecessary or too heavy to carry. Signs of strain were visible even in the dwellings themselves. Floors show evidence of repeated repair. Walls bear marks of constant maintenance. Tools, once plentiful, become scarcer in the archaeological record, suggesting that the effort to maintain life exceeded the simple act of production. Grain storage was rotated more carefully, and evidence indicates smaller rations during periods of drought. These adjustments demonstrate awareness of risk, but also hint at the beginning of the end of long-term sustainability in certain areas. Social structures, though resilient, began to reflect this stress. Some ceremonial practices may have been shortened or simplified. Kivas show signs of less frequent use. While the community remained intact, the underlying pressures, resource scarcity, environmental change, and population limits, were growing increasingly visible to everyone living in the cliffs. The rhythm of life became slower, heavier, and more deliberate. Migration decisions, when they began, were likely complex. Families had to weigh the security of the cliffs against the potential of unknown lands below. Leaving meant abandoning the familiar, risking conflict, and relying on luck and knowledge of distant territories. Yet staying meant continued struggle against diminishing returns from farms, water sources, and firewood. Over time, leaving became the more rational choice. Gradually, small groups of people stepped down from the cliffs, carrying their knowledge, tools, and essential provisions. These departures did not mark chaos. They did not indicate failure in the usual sense. The ancestral Puebloans were not fleeing an invader or escaping sudden catastrophe. They were responding rationally to slow, accumulating environmental stress. The decision to leave was the result of careful observation, community discussion, and deliberate planning. People likely walked away knowing that survival was still possible, but only elsewhere. By the time significant portions of the community had departed, entire sections of the cliff dwellings were empty. Cooking areas were left partially stocked, personal items remained, and ceremonial spaces showed no signs of abrupt destruction. It was as if the people had quietly taken themselves out of the system, leaving behind the structure as evidence of life, not death. The cliffs, once a protective and stabilizing environment, became silent witnesses. They watched as households moved down into valleys or beyond, gradually emptying the once thriving communities. For decades, small movements continued. Families followed paths to new settlements, carrying traditions, crops, and knowledge with them. The cliffs, while still standing, were no longer the center of daily life. In retrospect, these early departures demonstrate both the resilience and the limits of the ancestral Puebloan system. The people were careful, adaptive, and deliberate. They knew their environment intimately. They measured risk and made incremental adjustments. Yet even the most patient and organized society has limits. When environmental pressures exceed the benefits of a settled life, the rational choice is relocation. The cliffs did not fail them. They simply could no longer contain the life that had thrived there for centuries. The slow exodus also hints at the human side of abandonment. Departures were measured, leaving behind evidence of routine, of normal life, not desperation. Pots remained in storage, tools were left in place. Floors and walls show no trace of hurried destruction. Life continued elsewhere, just out of sight. And as the cliffs emptied, the silence that followed was not empty of meaning. It was full of history.
the quiet, careful history of a people who survived as long as they could and then moved on when survival required it.
Part 7. The Final Generations and Complete Abandonment. Over generations, the remaining ancestral Puebloans faced a quiet but undeniable reality. The cliffs could no longer sustain their communities. Families had already begun moving away in small groups, seeking more reliable water, more fertile soil, and safer locations for survival. Those who remained were likely the most rooted, the oldest, or the most committed to place, clinging to the familiar stone walls and the rituals that had guided their lives for centuries. Daily life in these final years must have been slow and measured. Every task carried weight. Fetching water demanded longer trips. Maintaining homes required constant effort. Fields were smaller and less productive. Food storage was critical, and rations may have been tight during extended dry periods. The effort to maintain routine was greater than before, but the rhythm of life persisted. People continued to wake with the sun, grind corn, tend crops, and participate in communal tasks. The cliffs still offered shelter and safety, even if life had become more burdensome. Kivas, once the center of communal ritual, likely reflected these pressures. Ceremonies may have been shorter or more selective. Participation was still necessary, but the scale and frequency of ritual could no longer match earlier generations. The people still understood the significance of tradition, yet practical survival demanded adaptation. Ritual and necessity intertwined, as they always had, but the balance was now shifting in favor of survival. Social structures, though intact, were stretched thin. Leaders and skilled individuals were fewer, and the burden of decision-making fell on a smaller pool of capable adults. Tasks once distributed across larger families now required concentrated effort. Repairs, food storage, and field management became labor-intensive responsibilities shared among fewer people. Every decision mattered more. Mistakes had consequences, even if subtle. Survival required foresight, careful planning, and observation of subtle environmental cues. By the early 1300s, the cliffs were largely abandoned. Evidence suggests that the final departures were deliberate and orderly. People carried essentials, tools, seed corn, and possibly ceremonial items. They did not destroy the structures they left behind. Walls remained intact. Floors were swept clean of obvious debris. Kitchens and storage spaces were left as they were used, not in haste. Even ceremonial kivas were vacated with care, leaving the spaces prepared for potential return, a return that would never happen. The process of abandonment was gradual, spanning decades rather than a single season. Families likely left at different times, following pathways into valleys or across mesas, reconnecting with other communities, or establishing new settlements in safer or more fertile areas. Departures were based on observation, practicality, and necessity rather than fear or conflict. The cliffs did not force them out. Environmental pressures nudged them toward rational choices. Archaeological evidence shows that pottery, tools, and personal items were often taken along, while larger, heavier objects were left behind. Storage pits, once stocked with carefully rationed grain, were emptied or abandoned with minor attention. There is little evidence of violence or destruction. The narrative is not of chaos. It is one of deliberate, incremental migration, a slow fading of life from a place that had nurtured generations. The cliffs themselves, silent and enduring, became monuments to the decisions of their inhabitants. They tell a story of resilience, adaptation, and careful planning. They show how communities could thrive in harsh, unforgiving landscapes for centuries using intelligence, observation, and cooperation. Yet they also reveal the limits of even the most disciplined systems. Environmental change, scarcity, and cumulative stress eventually demanded that the people move on. Modern visitors to these sites often describe the ruins as haunting or mysterious. Walls stand tall, kivas are empty, and floors bear the marks of long-ago lives.
But the quiet should not be mistaken for emptiness. The cliffs preserve a history of ordinary people who lived deliberately, rhythmically, and with deep awareness of their environment. Their departure was not dramatic, violent, or sudden. It was the culmination of centuries of careful living, adaptation, and decision-making. In leaving the cliffs, the ancestral Puebloans did not vanish entirely. Their descendants continued elsewhere, carrying seeds, stories, and traditions. New communities arose, preserving elements of culture and knowledge. The cliffs remained as reminders of ingenuity, patience, and slow, persistent adaptation to a difficult land. The final generations represent a careful conclusion rather than collapse. They exemplify a people who understood limits, respected their environment, and made choices over decades rather than hours. They abandoned their homes not in panic, but with reason, foresight, and a quiet acknowledgement that survival demanded change. The cliffs remain, silent witnesses to a long, deliberate, and ultimately human story.
Part 8. Legacy of the Ancestral Puebloans and Modern Reflection. Long after the cliffs were empty, the influence of the ancestral Puebloans persisted. Their structures, carefully built into stone walls, remained. Kivas and rooms endured for centuries, showing not only architectural skill, but also a methodical approach to life in a harsh landscape. Unlike sudden ruins left by wars or disasters, these cliff dwellings tell a story of gradual change, adaptation, and eventual departure. They are a record of ordinary life lived deliberately over generations. The descendants of these people did not vanish. Many moved south or joined other Pueblo communities, bringing with them seeds, knowledge of farming, pottery techniques, and ritual practices. The same traditions that guided life in the cliffs, the Three Sisters farming method, the careful observation of seasonal cycles, and communal ritual, continued in new locations. While the cliff dwellings were abandoned, culture did not end. It transformed. Modern archaeologists and historians study these sites to understand how humans lived in balance with a challenging environment. Unlike dramatic historical events that leave vivid written records, the story of the ancestral Puebloans requires careful observation, patience, and interpretation of subtle evidence. Walls, stone floors, storage pits, and kivas provide clues. Tree rings, soil samples, and remnants of crops reveal how people adapted to rainfall, drought, and changing landscapes. Every artifact is a trace of thoughtful, incremental decision-making. Visitors to Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and other cliff dwellings often feel awe. The scale of construction and the precision of masonry are impressive, but the real lesson lies not in grandeur. It is in the slow accumulation of effort over time. The cliffs are monuments not to sudden greatness, but to sustained, careful living. They reflect the quiet intelligence of a people who planned ahead, observed carefully, and lived deliberately in rhythm with their environment. The ancestral Puebloans also teach about human limits. Even the most organized, careful, and patient society has thresholds. When environmental stress, resource scarcity, and logistical challenges exceeded the benefits of staying, leaving became the rational choice. This was not collapse, it was reasoned adaptation. It is a lesson about foresight, humility, and the value of paying attention to slow changes that eventually demand action. Today, the silence inside these cliffs can be striking. Walls remain intact, kivas are empty, and rooms appear frozen in time. Yet the story is not of emptiness, it is of enduring human ingenuity. Every stone, every carefully shaped room, every granary tells of people who lived deliberately, planned carefully, and made choices based on observation and experience. Life in the cliffs was not dramatic, flashy, or heroic in the conventional sense. It was slow, consistent, and remarkably human. The story of the ancestral Puebloans is also a reminder of history's subtlety. Not all important stories are loud. Some are quiet, some are measured, some unfold over centuries rather than moments.
Their legacy is not written in battle, conquest, or political upheaval. It is written in stone walls, storage pits, in the careful positioning of rooms. It is written in patience. By studying these spaces, we see a people who managed risk, understood limits, and made deliberate choices for survival. They remind us that history does not always come with drama or spectacle. Sometimes the most remarkable stories are the ones in which people simply lived carefully, observed their world, and adapted when necessary. The ancestral Puebloans' departure was slow, orderly, and reasoned, a conclusion that speaks volumes about human resilience and intelligence, even in the absence of written records. In the end, their cliff dwellings endure as silent teachers. They teach about adaptation, community, labor, and foresight. They teach about living deliberately, responding to environmental stress, and making measured decisions. The cliffs do not shout their story, they whisper it, and those who listen carefully can understand a history that is far from boring, not in significance, but in its quiet, deliberate persistence.
Part 9. Environmental Change, Drought, and the Final Departure. By the late 1200s, the American Southwest faced environmental pressures that were subtle yet unrelenting. Rainfall patterns shifted, becoming more unpredictable. Some years brought enough moisture to support crops, but dry years lasted longer than before. Soil slowly lost fertility, and fields that had produced corn, beans, and squash for generations became increasingly unreliable. Trees and shrubs used for firewood and building materials were scarcer. Life in the cliffs, which had once been sustainable and carefully managed, grew heavier and more uncertain. The ancestral Puebloans responded the way they always had, with observation and adaptation. Farmers carefully adjusted planting schedules, moved crops to slightly more favorable locations, and reinforced terraces to conserve soil. Water from natural seeps in small catchment areas was rationed more strictly. Granaries were checked frequently, and stored food became a vital lifeline. Every household, every family member participated in the slow calculations that determined whether life could continue in place or required change. Despite these efforts, the pressure of cumulative stress became undeniable. Archaeological evidence suggests that household sizes shrank in response to scarcity. Families divided their labor more efficiently. Tasks such as grinding corn, carrying water, repairing walls, or maintaining trails required more energy and coordination. Even with careful planning, it was clear that the cliffs were approaching their limits. The landscape could only support a finite population, and the available resources were declining. Signs of environmental strain are visible in tree ring records, soil deposits, and remnants of fields. Years of drought occurred more frequently, limiting crop yields. Terraces eroded faster. Water channels carried less flow. Small adjustments that had been sufficient for centuries were no longer enough. Life did not collapse immediately. It slowed. It became more deliberate. Tasks that were once routine required careful calculation and additional effort. This is the kind of stress that does not make headlines. It is invisible in the moment, accumulating quietly until a threshold is reached. At some point, families began to make difficult choices. Small groups departed from the cliff dwellings before others. They carried essentials, tools, seed corn, and other vital supplies. Departures were methodical rather than frantic. Cooking areas were emptied, but floors and walls remained largely intact. Ceremonial spaces, including kivas, were vacated respectfully. There was no evidence of large-scale conflict or forced evacuation. These were considered, reasoned decisions made with the understanding that survival required relocation. As more families left, the population in the cliffs decreased gradually. Social routines continued, but with fewer participants. Ceremonial gatherings were smaller. Work in fields and terraces was redistributed among remaining households. Tasks that once could be completed efficiently now required longer hours and greater coordination.
Even with reduced numbers, life inside the cliffs remained structured and deliberate, reflecting the persistence of habit, knowledge, and social organization. The departure from the cliffs did not happen overnight. It was a slow, incremental migration over several decades. Families moved to lower valleys, better watered areas, or joined nearby settlements. The decision to leave was driven not by fear or sudden disaster, but by rational observation and long-term planning. Survival required it. Staying in place risked exhausting food, water, and fuel to the point that even careful strategies would fail. Those who left understood that the cliffs, once a haven, could no longer support the demands of life. When the final departure occurred, the cliffs were left silent yet remarkably intact. Walls stood, roofs of kivas and homes remained, and storage spaces retained traces of their careful organization. The community had not been destroyed, it had simply moved. The cliffs bore witness to a methodical conclusion, a slow fade of human presence shaped by centuries of careful adaptation and environmental awareness. Modern visitors see only empty walls and silent rooms. They may imagine abandonment is sudden or dramatic. In reality, the departure of the ancestral Puebloans was the product of patience, observation, and reason. It was a decision made over decades, shaped by slow environmental change and cumulative stress rather than catastrophe or violence. Life inside the cliffs had been sustained through careful planning for centuries. Departure was not failure. It was the logical next step in a long and deliberate story. Part 10. Archaeological evidence in what it reveals about daily life. Even centuries after the ancestral Puebloans abandoned the cliffs, the structures and artifacts they left behind continue to tell a story. Archaeologists, carefully studying walls, floors, and storage pits, reconstruct life in remarkable detail. Unlike written records, these clues are subtle. They're small, quiet indicators of routine, organization, and adaptation. Every stone, every grain of corn, every tool fragment offers insight into a society that lived deliberately and carefully, year after year. One of the most revealing aspects of these sites is the layout of the dwellings. Rooms were small but highly functional. Bedrooms, storage areas, cooking spaces, and ceremonial kivas were placed with intention. Walls were thick, often with multiple layers of stone, creating insulation from both heat and cold. Floors were leveled or slightly depressed to collect debris and maintain organization. In some homes, small niches held tools or personal items, showing an awareness of space and a method for keeping daily life orderly. Artifacts found in these homes provide further insight. Grinding stones, often worn smooth from centuries of use, reveal the labor-intensive process of preparing corn and other crops. Cooking utensils, pots, and storage containers indicate a diet based on corn, beans, squash, and small amounts of game or wild plants. Careful storage suggests that surplus was limited, rationed, and preserved against uncertain seasons. Every object has a story, not of extravagance, but of careful, measured survival. Kivas, the ceremonial spaces, offer additional information. Their construction, often circular, partially subterranean, with ventilation shafts and carefully leveled floors, demonstrates both technical skill and ritual importance. The arrangement of these rooms within the cliff complexes suggests that ceremonial life was integrated into daily routines. They were neither optional nor spectacular. They were a framework for community cohesion and instruction, a space where knowledge, tradition, and observation were passed down silently through repetition. Patterns of wear on stone floors and steps reveal movement and routine. Certain paths were heavily used, connecting sleeping areas to cooking spaces, storage rooms, and the cliff edge. Other areas were less worn, likely reserved for ceremonial or less frequent activities. Even the distribution of refuse, broken tools, discarded food remnants, pottery shards, offer clues about organization, waste management, and priorities. There was a method in what might seem like mundane detail. Tree ring data and soil analysis complement the archaeological record. They reveal the timing of droughts, soil depletion, and environmental pressures. This evidence, combined with the placement of terraces and water catchments, shows that the ancestral Puebloans observed their environment carefully, adapting planting schedules, storage methods, and community organization to slow but persistent changes. They were not passive observers. They responded thoughtfully to every challenge the landscape presented. The absence of fortifications or signs of conflict in most sites is also telling. Life was difficult because of environmental conditions, not human violence. The careful construction of homes and storage spaces, the integration of community spaces, and the slow, deliberate departure from the cliffs all point to a society guided by observation, planning, and reason. Every decision, where to place a home, how to store grain, when to perform rituals, was practical as well as cultural. Pottery fragments, although often small and broken, reveal aesthetic values and practical priorities. Designs were often simple yet durable. They balanced utility with modest decoration. There was no extravagance. Even artistic expression was restrained, reflecting the slow, careful life of the people. Tools were repaired repeatedly rather than replaced, indicating resourcefulness and patience. The cliffs themselves as archaeological sites remain perhaps the most informative evidence of daily life. Every wall, every ledge, every storage niche is a record of human adaptation over centuries. Unlike monuments built for display, these spaces reflect the ordinary, repetitive, yet deliberate work of survival, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. The ancestral Puebloans did not need to leave records because their homes, tools, and landscape carry their history quietly, persisting long after human presence faded. In studying these sites, we see a society that prioritized stability, observation, and incremental improvement over rapid change or conquest. They managed resources, monitored environmental shifts, and adjusted communal routines over decades. Their departure, when it came, was a continuation of the same careful reasoning, not a break in it. Archaeological evidence captures this. It tells us that life in the cliffs was sustained, orderly, and deliberate, boring only to the dramatic eye, but endlessly informative to those who study it carefully. Even today, walking through these ruins, one can sense the rhythm of life, the careful organization of rooms, the attention to water, crops, and communal space, and the quiet consistency that allowed people to survive in an unforgiving landscape. Archaeology doesn't just uncover objects, it uncovers behavior, decisions, and values. It allows us to understand, with subtlety and patience, the lives of people who managed to live deliberately, carefully, and thoughtfully for centuries, and then left the cliffs with reasoned foresight, leaving a silent, enduring legacy behind. Part 11. The long-term impact of abandonment on the landscape and culture. The cliffs and mesas of the American Southwest remained long after the ancestral Puebloans departed, silent witnesses to centuries of careful human habitation. Abandonment did not erase their impact on the land. Fields, terraces, and water catchments continued to shape soil patterns, directing runoff and sediment in ways that persisted for generations. Even without human hands actively managing the environment, the subtle footprints of daily work remained. The placement of terraces slowed erosion. Small check dams and planting areas captured sediment long after they were no longer maintained. The land carried the memory of human adaptation, quietly preserving the imprint of centuries of observation and effort. The physical structures, stone walls, kivas, and storage rooms remained as well, slowly weathering under the elements. Roofs collapsed in some cases, but walls stood firm, revealing the durability of construction methods. Archaeologists studying these sites today can trace generations of maintenance and repair, indicating that the people did not merely build and leave. Every layer of stone, every repaired wall tells a story of incremental adaptation, efforts, and care. The cliffs themselves became a palimpsest of human life, each layer recording the passage of time, the skill of builders, and the rhythms of a society in balance with its environment. Culturally, the departure of the ancestral Puebloans reshaped communities beyond the cliffs. Descendants carried traditions, crops, and practices to new locations. Techniques for terrace farming, water management, and food storage persisted. Rituals, ceremonial structures, and social norms moved with them, adapting to new landscapes while maintaining continuity with the past. Knowledge of seasonal cycles, planting, and survival strategies was transmitted orally. While the cliffs were emptied, culture migrated, proving resilient even in the face of environmental stress. These communities preserved memory, practices, and social cohesion in ways that modern observers might overlook because the changes were gradual, subtle, and integrated into daily life. Environmental impact was equally subtle. Abandoned fields slowly returned to natural vegetation, but terraces and planting areas remained distinguishable for centuries. Trees, shrubs, and grasses grew among stone walls, and erosion patterns carried traces of human modification long after people had left. Even today, satellite images reveal outlines of former settlements, paths, and agricultural areas. Human adaptation left a permanent, though subtle mark on the land. The Southwest had been reshaped by centuries of careful, deliberate living. The departure did not erase the effects of their stewardship. It simply ended active management, leaving the land to adjust slowly to the absence of human intervention. The archaeological record shows that abandonment was gradual. Rooms were vacated in sequence, storage pits emptied selectively, and ceremonial spaces remained intact but unused. This pattern indicates foresight and planning rather than desperation. People left provisions behind in some cases, possibly anticipating future return, even though it never occurred. Abandonment was not chaotic, it was reasoned, measured, and reflective of centuries of experience living under environmental constraints. These decisions ensured that culture, knowledge, and memory survived in new locations, even as the cliffs were emptied. Abandonment also changed the perception of these landscapes for future generations. Later groups entering the region encountered structures that were already centuries old. Walls, kivas, and terraces hinted at a sophisticated society that had once managed resources carefully, understood environmental rhythms, and adapted over generations. Oral histories preserved fragments of knowledge about the cliffs, emphasizing their spiritual, practical, and social significance. Over time, these sites became more than abandoned dwellings. They became markers of human endurance, patience, and adaptation. For modern observers, the legacy of the ancestral Puebloans is not in dramatic monuments, but in subtle lessons. The cliffs demonstrate the value of careful observation, incremental adaptation, and reasoned decision-making. They reveal how humans can live in balance with a challenging environment for centuries, and how even the most patient, disciplined societies eventually face limits. Abandonment, in this sense, was not failure. It was a rational response to slow, persistent environmental change. The land, shaped by human hands for generations, bore witness to these decisions long after the last person walked away. Even today, the cliffs whisper stories of deliberate life. Terraces, walls, and kivas speak of centuries of slow effort, careful planning, and knowledge transmitted through observation and action. They remind us that human impact is not always immediate or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and enduring. The ancestral Puebloans left behind a landscape and a cultural footprint that continues to teach about adaptation, patience, and the consequences of living thoughtfully in a fragile environment. The long-term impact of abandonment is therefore both tangible and cultural. Physically, the cliffs and terraces persist, quietly marking centuries of labor and planning. Culturally, traditions and knowledge carried by descendants ensured that the lessons of careful living survived. Even without people, the land preserved evidence of human thought, planning, and adaptation, making the cliffs both a historical record and a subtle monument to persistence, patience, and deliberate life. Modern archaeology has transformed the way we understand the ancestral Puebloans and their cliff dwellings. What once appeared as silent ruins are now recognized as detailed records of centuries-long human adaptation. Careful excavation, preservation, and analysis have revealed the rhythms of daily life, social organization, and environmental management. Archaeologists study walls, floors, storage pits, and kivas not just to catalog objects, but to reconstruct behavior, decision-making, and cultural priorities. Every tool fragment, every worn stone, and every residue of food offers insight into lives that were deliberate, measured, and remarkably consistent. Preservation is crucial because these sites are fragile. Exposure to weather, human visitation, and natural erosion threaten structures that have stood for over 800 years. Roofs collapse, walls crumble, and terraces erode. Yet even in partial ruin, the cliff dwellings communicate information about construction methods, communal organization, and daily life. Preservation efforts today ensure that researchers and visitors can continue to learn from these sites. They demonstrate a careful balance between human curiosity and environmental respect, reflecting the same values that guided the original inhabitants. Excavations reveal not only physical structures, but also the subtle social organization of communities. The arrangement of rooms, the placement of kivas, and the layout of terraces show careful thought about labor distribution, community interaction, and resource management. Tools and pottery fragments tell stories about efficiency, utility, and craftsmanship. Patterns of wear and repair indicate priorities and limitations. Archaeologists can trace changes over decades, observing how societies adapted to drought, soil exhaustion, and population shifts. These patterns reveal incremental decision-making rather than sudden crisis, a slow, deliberate response to environmental constraints. Artifacts found in the cliffs also tell a story of social life. Storage pits show careful rationing, suggesting a culture attuned to scarcity and seasonal variability. Ceremonial items and kivas indicate a deep integration of ritual and routine, where community cohesion was reinforced through regular participation in cultural practices. Even children's artifacts, such as small tools or miniature pottery, reveal the education and socialization processes that prepared young members to maintain the delicate balance of community life. Life in the cliffs was not dramatic or conspicuous, but it was remarkably organized, methodical, and resilient. Modern reflection on these sites highlights lessons beyond archaeology. The ancestral Puebloans managed limited resources with patience and foresight. They understood environmental limits and adapted over centuries. They made incremental changes, observed patterns, and responded to subtle signals in their surroundings. When survival demanded relocation, they acted deliberately and without panic. These lessons remain relevant today, offering insight into how human societies interact with fragile environments over long periods. Sustainability, patience, and observation were not abstract ideals, they were practical strategies essential for survival. The preservation of cliff dwellings allows us to understand a society that functioned without written records. Knowledge was transmitted orally and through practice, and the structures themselves became archives of daily life. Walls, floors, and terraces are not just physical remnants, they are repositories of decision-making, labor, and cultural continuity. The people who built, maintained, and eventually left these dwellings shaped a landscape that communicated their priorities long after they were gone. Modern archaeology decodes these messages with patience, care, and attention to detail, much like the ancestral Puebloans approached their work centuries ago. Even today, visitors experience a sense of quiet continuity. Walking through the cliff dwellings, observing the alignment of rooms, and noting the scale of terraces, one can appreciate the rhythm and deliberation of daily life. The ancestral Puebloans were not builders of spectacle, but of function. Their legacy is subtle, measured, and embedded in the very stones and soil of the Southwest. Preservation allows this quiet story to continue, offering both tangible and philosophical lessons about adaptation, community, and careful observation of the natural world. In reflecting on the ancestral Puebloans, modern observers are reminded that history is not always dramatic. Some of the most profound lessons are found in slow, deliberate actions, in the careful management of resources, and in the measured responses to environmental change. The cliff dwellings are not monuments to kings or warriors. They are monuments to patience, resilience, and human ingenuity applied consistently over centuries. They preserve a quiet history of survival, community, and adaptation that continues to speak to us across time, demonstrating that the most important stories are sometimes the ones that unfold slowly, without fanfare, but with lasting impact.
Part 13. Lessons from the Ancestral Puebloans for Modern Life. The story of the ancestral Puebloans does not end with abandoned cliffs and silent rooms. Its most enduring value lies in the lessons it offers to modern life. These lessons are not dramatic or heroic. They are quiet, practical, and grounded in routine. They emerge from centuries of careful observation, incremental change, and deliberate decision-making. The people who lived in the cliffs survived not by conquering their environment, but by understanding it deeply and responding with patience. One of the clearest lessons is the importance of long-term thinking. The ancestral Puebloans planned their lives around seasons, rainfall patterns, and soil conditions that changed slowly over time. They did not assume stability. Instead, they expected variability and built systems to absorb it. Terraces slowed erosion, storage rooms preserved food, and social structures distributed labor efficiently. Modern societies often prioritize speed and short-term outcomes. The cliff dwellings remind us that sustainability depends on anticipating gradual change and preparing for uncertainty long before it becomes a crisis. Resource management is another central lesson. The ancestral Puebloans lived with strict limits. Water was scarce, arable land was finite, wood and fuel had to be gathered carefully. Nothing was wasted casually. Tools were repaired, pottery reused, and storage carefully monitored. This approach required constant attention and discipline. In modern life, abundance can obscure limits. The archaeological record of the cliffs shows that restraint, not excess, enabled survival. Managing resources carefully was not an ethical choice alone. It was a practical necessity embedded in daily routine. Social organization also played a critical role. Life in the cliffs required cooperation at every level. Farming, construction, water management, and storage depended on shared effort and coordination. Kivas reinforced social bonds and cultural continuity, ensuring that knowledge and values were transmitted across generations. Decisions were not made in isolation. They were shaped by collective experience and shared responsibility. Modern societies often emphasize individual autonomy. The ancestral Puebloans demonstrate that resilience emerges from interdependence and coordinated action, especially in challenging environments. Adaptation stands out as a defining characteristic. The ancestral Puebloans adjusted planting techniques, modified dwellings, and reorganized communities as conditions changed. These adaptations were incremental, not revolutionary. There is little evidence of abrupt shifts or radical experiments. Instead, change occurred through observation, testing, and refinement over decades. This slow approach reduced risk and preserved stability. In contrast, modern responses to environmental and social challenges often seek immediate solutions. The cliffs illustrate the power of gradual adjustment guided by experience rather than urgency. Equally important is the lesson of knowing when to leave. Abandonment of the cliff dwellings was not a failure or collapse. It was a reasoned decision made after careful evaluation of environmental limits. The people recognized that continued occupation would strain resources beyond sustainability. They chose relocation as a strategy for survival. This decision required humility and foresight.
Modern societies often resist change, even when conditions clearly demand it. The ancestral Puebloans show that resilience sometimes means letting go, relocating, or redefining priorities in response to long-term pressures. The absence of excess in their material culture is also instructive. The artifacts left behind are functional, durable, and modest. There is little evidence of accumulation for status or display. Labor was invested where it mattered most: shelter, food, water, and community. This focus on essentials reduced vulnerability and increased efficiency. In modern life, complexity and consumption can create fragility. The cliff dwellings remind us that simplicity, when combined with skill and planning, can be a powerful form of resilience. Finally, the ancestral Puebloans teach the value of quiet continuity. Their society endured for centuries without written records, monumental architecture, or dramatic expansion. Knowledge was transmitted through practice, observation, and participation in daily life. Culture persisted because it was embedded in routine rather than spectacle. Modern societies often measure success through visibility and scale. The cliffs suggest another measure: longevity through balance, consistency, and adaptation. The lessons of the ancestral Puebloans are not prescriptions, but perspectives. They encourage patience, restraint, cooperation, and respect for environmental limits. Their story shows that survival is often achieved not through bold action, but through careful attention to detail and a willingness to adjust gradually. The cliff dwellings stand as quiet reminders that some of the most enduring solutions are built slowly, maintained collectively, and adapted thoughtfully over time. In this way, the past continues to inform the present, offering guidance not through drama, but through steady, deliberate example.
Part 14. Final Reflection. A quiet ending that still speaks. By the time the last family walked away from the cliff dwellings, nothing dramatic marked the moment. No final ceremony carved into stone. No written record declaring an ending. Life simply continued elsewhere. The cliffs remained, holding empty rooms, worn steps, and silent kivas. What had once been a living community became a paused moment in time. This quiet ending is what defines the story of the ancestral Puebloans more than anything else. It was not an ending shaped by disaster, but by understanding. Standing today before these dwellings, one does not encounter evidence of chaos or collapse. Instead, there is order frozen in place. Storage rooms remain where they were meant to be. Doorways are intact. Paths still guide the eye from one space to another. This organization reflects how the people lived until the very end, methodically, calmly, and with intention. They did not flee, they concluded a chapter of their history when circumstances made it necessary. The final reflection of this story lies in how ordinary it truly was. The ancestral Puebloans woke each day to the same concerns shared by people across time: food, shelter, weather, family, and community. They worked stone with patience. They planted crops with hope, but without certainty. They stored food not for comfort, but for survival. Over generations, these small acts accumulated into a stable society capable of lasting centuries in a demanding environment. Nothing about their daily life was glamorous, yet everything about it was effective. Modern observers often search history for turning points and dramatic moments. The cliff dwellings offer something different. They show that endurance is often built through repetition rather than revolution. Walls were repaired year after year. Terraces were maintained stone by stone. Knowledge was passed quietly from elders to children through demonstration, not instruction manuals. This consistency allowed the society to absorb change slowly, responding to environmental stress without panic or disorder. Even abandonment itself followed this pattern. It was not a sudden rupture, it was a continuation of the same careful reasoning that had guided life for generations. When droughts lengthened and resources thinned, the people evaluated their situation honestly. They recognized limits. Rather than exhausting the land beyond recovery, they chose to move.
This decision preserved not only their lives, but their culture. The cliffs were left intact because they were respected even as they were left behind. In this way, the story resists a dramatic conclusion. There is no clear ending scene. Instead, there is a gradual fading of human presence and the quiet persistence of stone. The land reasserted itself slowly, just as human occupation had once shaped it slowly. Wind, rain, and time became the new caretakers of the dwellings. Yet the human story did not disappear. It remained embedded in walls, terraces, and pathways, visible to anyone willing to look carefully. The USA boring history style is well suited to this story because its power lies in restraint. There is no need to exaggerate or dramatize what already speaks through evidence. The ancestral Puebloans do not impress through conquest or expansion. They impress through balance, patience, and long-term thinking. Their legacy is not a single achievement, but a sustained way of living that worked until conditions changed. Today, the cliffs stand as reminders that success does not always mean permanence. Sometimes success means knowing when a system has reached its natural limit and responding thoughtfully. The ancestral Puebloans did not fail to hold the cliffs. They succeeded in recognizing when holding on was no longer wise. That awareness is rare in history and even rarer in modern life. The final reflection, then, is simple. This story is not about disappearance. It is about continuity through change. The people left the cliffs, but they did not vanish. Their knowledge, traditions, and values moved forward, adapting to new landscapes just as they had adapted to the cliffs centuries earlier. The stone rooms remain as evidence of a society that understood time differently, not as something to race against, but as something to live within. In the end, the ancestral Puebloans left behind no written conclusion, no final message. What they left instead was an example, a quiet one, a patient one, a reminder that history does not always end with noise. Sometimes it ends with silence, and that silence still has something important to say. Part 15. After the Silence: How the Cliffs Are Experienced Today. Long after the ancestral Puebloans left the cliffs, people returned, not to live, but to look. Modern visitors arrive with cameras, guidebooks, and carefully marked trails. They stand where families once cooked, stored food, and slept through cold desert nights. The experience is quiet, restrained, and observational, much like the life that once unfolded there. Nothing moves quickly. The cliffs demand patience from those who walk among them. The first thing most visitors notice is scale. The rooms are smaller than expected. Doorways are low. Ceilings are close. This immediately changes perception. These were not spaces built for comfort in the modern sense. They were built for function, efficiency, and protection. Standing inside a room, it becomes clear that daily life required constant awareness of space, movement, and shared use. Nothing was accidental. Every wall had a purpose. Every opening was placed with intent. Guides often explain how people moved through the dwellings, carrying water up steep paths, hauling firewood, grinding corn by hand. These explanations are factual, almost understated. There's no need to dramatize the effort. The stone steps themselves tell the story through wear and erosion. The cliffs record repetition better than words ever could. Thousands of small movements, repeated over centuries, shaped these spaces more than any single event. Modern preservation policies reflect a deep respect for this quiet history. Visitors are asked not to touch walls, not to remove artifacts, not to wander beyond designated paths. This controlled access mirrors the care with which the ancestral Puebloans managed their environment. Preservation today is an extension of the same principle. Restraint ensures longevity. The goal is not to recreate life in the cliffs, but to allow the evidence of that life to endure with minimal interference. The silence inside the dwellings often surprises visitors. Wind moves through openings, birds nest in high crevices. Sound does not linger. This silence is not emptiness, it is continuity. The absence of human activity allows the structures to speak through their arrangement and condition. The lack of furniture, decoration, or personal items forces attention to structure and design. What remains is the framework of daily life stripped of distraction. Over time, interpretation of these sites has become more careful and less speculative. Early theories often imagined sudden collapse or violence. Modern research emphasizes gradual change, planning, and adaptation. This shift mirrors a broader understanding of history as something shaped by long processes rather than dramatic moments. The cliffs teach this lesson quietly, rewarding careful observation rather than quick conclusions. For many visitors, the experience becomes reflective. Standing in a kiva, one might think about community and routine rather than ceremony or mystery. Looking across terraces, one notices the labor required to maintain them year after year. These are not places that encourage excitement, they encourage attention. The cliffs slow people down, forcing them to confront a way of life built on patience and repetition. In this way, the story continues. The ancestral Puebloans no longer live in the cliffs, but their presence shapes how modern people move, speak, and think within them. Trails follow ancient paths, viewing platforms align with old sightlines. Even modern safety measures adapt to the logic of the original construction. The past is not reenacted, it is accommodated. The final effect of visiting these places is subtle. There is no clear takeaway, no dramatic lesson delivered at the end. Instead, there is a lingering awareness that complex societies can exist quietly, that success does not require expansion or visibility, and that leaving a place can be as thoughtful as building it. The cliffs do not explain themselves, they wait. In the end, the ancestral Puebloans are encountered not as distant figures, but as careful planners whose choices still structure the experience of the present. Their legacy is not loud, it does not demand attention. It simply remains, stone by stone, asking modern observers to slow down, look closely, and consider the value of a life lived deliberately, even after the people themselves are gone.
Part 16. Why this story fits the USA boring history tradition. The story of the ancestral Puebloans fits naturally into what is often called boring history in the United States, not because it lacks meaning, but because it avoids spectacle. There are no famous names, no decisive battles, no dramatic speeches. What remains is routine, repetition, gradual change. This kind of history rarely draws immediate attention, yet it forms the foundation of how societies actually function and endure over long periods of time. American audiences often associate history with events that move quickly: wars, discoveries, expansions. The cliff dwellings challenge this expectation. They represent a different kind of historical narrative, one defined by continuity rather than disruption. Day after day, year after year, people performed the same tasks: carrying water, grinding corn, repairing walls, maintaining terraces. These actions did not make headlines, but they sustained life for centuries. This is the core of boring history, the accumulation of ordinary decisions that quietly shape outcomes. The absence of written records reinforces this perspective. Without dates, declarations, or personal accounts, the story must be reconstructed through material evidence. Archaeologists read walls, tools, and patterns of wear instead of texts. This process mirrors the slow pace of the history itself. Understanding comes gradually through careful comparison and patient analysis. There is no single moment that explains everything. Meaning emerges over time, just as the society itself did.
Another reason this story fits the tradition is its resistance to clear conclusions. There is no moment of collapse, no definitive ending. The departure from the cliffs unfolded over decades. Some families left earlier, others stayed longer. Life continued, simply in different locations. This lack of a dramatic endpoint can feel unsatisfying to audiences accustomed to clear resolutions, yet it reflects reality more accurately than many conventional historical narratives. Change is often incremental, uneven, and quiet. The ancestral Puebloans also challenge common ideas of success. They did not expand aggressively or dominate large territories. They did not leave monuments meant to impress outsiders. Their success lay in stability and persistence. They created systems that worked well enough to last for generations. In the context of boring history, this kind of success is central. It highlights the value of maintenance, cooperation, and restraint, qualities that rarely attract attention but are essential to long-term survival. This story also aligns with the American tradition of landscape-based history. Much of U.S. history is tied to land, farms, towns, roads, and settlements shaped by geography and climate. The cliff dwellings are an extreme example of this relationship. Every architectural decision reflects environmental conditions. The cliffs show how humans adapt to place rather than imposing abstract designs upon it. This grounded, practical interaction with the land fits well within a historical approach that values material reality over ideology. The tone of boring history is particularly suited for the cliffs because emotion is not absent but restrained. There is no need to dramatize struggle or loss. The evidence speaks quietly. Scarcity, effort, and adaptation are visible without exaggeration. The emotional weight comes from recognition rather than shock, from realizing how much work went into maintaining a life that left so little behind. This understated quality encourages reflection rather than reaction. In this sense, the story rewards patience. Listeners who stay with it begin to notice patterns, how architecture reflects social organization, how environmental change influences behavior, how communities adjust without spectacle. These realizations do not arrive suddenly, they accumulate slowly, mirroring the history itself. This alignment between form and content is why the story works so well within the boring history tradition. Ultimately, the ancestral Puebloans remind us that history does not belong only to moments of crisis or transformation. It also belongs to the long stretches of time when people simply lived, worked, adapted, and made careful choices. These periods may seem eventless, but they are where most human experience resides. The cliffs preserve this truth in stone, offering a history that is quiet, methodical, and deeply instructive. This is why the story endures, not because it shocks or entertains, but because it reflects how life is usually lived. Slowly, carefully, with attention to limits and routines. In a historical tradition that values patience and detail over drama, the ancestral Puebloans occupy a natural place. Their legacy is not loud, but it is lasting, and that is precisely what makes it worth telling. Part 17. Time, Distance, and How Memory Slowly Fades. As centuries passed, time began to work on the cliff dwellings in the most ordinary way possible. Stone weathered, wood decayed, roofs collapsed gradually, one beam at a time. Nothing sudden occurred. No single moment marked the transition from inhabited homes to ruins. Instead, distance grew quietly. Distance between the people who once lived there and the generations who followed. Memory faded not through loss, but through replacement. New routines formed elsewhere, and old ones became less necessary to remember. For the descendants of the ancestral Puebloans, life continued in new regions, shaped by different conditions. Rivers replaced cliffs, open valleys replaced stone walls. Daily concerns shifted, but underlying knowledge persisted in altered form. Agricultural practices evolved, ceremonies adapted. Over time, specific memories of the cliff dwellings became less central. This was not abandonment of identity, it was adaptation of memory. Societies do not carry every detail forward, they carry what remains useful. Meanwhile, the cliffs entered a long period of quiet. Plants grew between stones, animals nested in empty rooms, wind and rain became the primary occupants. Without maintenance, paths softened and terraces slowly eroded. Yet even as structures changed, their underlying design remained legible. The arrangement of rooms, the placement of kivas, and the logic of movement through space continued to communicate purpose. The cliffs were no longer homes, but they were not meaningless either. They became records, unintended but durable. When later peoples encountered these structures, they did not see recent history, they saw deep time. The builders were already distant, their lives separated by generations of change. Stories may have circulated, fragments of understanding passed along orally, but certainty faded. The cliffs became landmarks rather than living spaces. They inspired curiosity more than recognition. This gradual shift from memory to mystery was not abrupt. It unfolded slowly, just as the original occupation had. This process illustrates how history often works. Events do not disappear, they recede. Daily life moves forward, and what once demanded attention becomes background. The ancestral Puebloans did not intend to be forgotten, but they did not intend to be remembered either. They lived for their present, not for an audience centuries later. The fading of memory was not a failure of preservation, it was a natural consequence of time and change. Modern archaeology reverses this process partially. By studying stone, soil, and artifact patterns, researchers reconstruct what memory no longer holds. Yet this reconstruction is careful and limited. It does not restore voices or emotions. It restores structure, behavior, and decision-making. This incomplete recovery reflects the nature of boring history. What matters most is not the personal drama, but the systems that allowed life to continue. Distance also changes interpretation. What once felt ordinary now feels impressive. The effort required to survive in the cliffs seems remarkable only because modern life obscures such effort. Grinding corn by hand, carrying water daily, maintaining stone walls, these were not extraordinary tasks, they were expected. Over time, distance transforms necessity into achievement. This shift in perception says as much about the present as it does about the past. The cliffs themselves remain indifferent to interpretation. They do not explain, they do not emphasize, they persist. Their silence allows each generation to approach them differently, shaped by its own concerns and assumptions. This openness is part of their endurance. They are not locked to a single meaning. They accommodate slow reinterpretation, much like the society that built them accommodated gradual change. In the end, time does not erase history, it simplifies it. Details fall away, leaving patterns. The story of the ancestral Puebloans survives not because every aspect is remembered, but because the essential elements remain visible. Careful planning, adaptation, restraint, and continuity. These patterns are easier to see from a distance than they ever were up close. This is the quiet truth of boring history. Memory fades, structures weather, and routines dissolve, yet meaning persists in a reduced form. The cliffs stand not as complete narratives, but as outlines. They remind us that most lives are not remembered in detail, yet they still shape the world long after the people themselves are gone. Time moves on, distance grows, and history becomes quieter, but it does not disappear.
Part 18. What the cliffs teach us about ordinary human time. The cliff dwellings offer a lesson about time that is easy to miss. Not historical time measured in dates and centuries, but ordinary human time, the kind shaped by routines, seasons, and repeated effort. This is time experienced not as a sequence of events, but as continuity. Life in the cliffs unfolded through days that resembled one another closely. Morning tasks led to afternoon labor. Seasons returned with small variations. Years passed without sharp boundaries. This rhythm, rather than any single moment, defined existence. Ordinary human time is slow. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly through repetition. The ancestral Puebloans lived within this kind of time. They did not experience their lives as chapters of history. They experienced them as obligations, tending crops, repairing walls, preparing food, maintaining tools. These actions were not memorable individually. Their importance emerged only through consistency. A single repaired wall meant little. A wall repaired year after year meant survival. The cliffs record this kind of time more accurately than written history ever could. Worn steps show thousands of feet passing through the same space. Smooth grinding stones reflect countless hours of labor. Layers of repair in walls indicate generations of attention. These traces do not point to moments of change, they point to duration. They show how time is spent when nothing exceptional is happening. Modern perspectives often misunderstand this. We tend to view the past through compressed narratives, highlighting beginnings and endings. But most of human life happens between those points. The ancestral Puebloans remind us that what fills that space is not drama, but maintenance. Fields had to be tended, even in good years. Roofs required repair, even when they did not leak. Food had to be prepared regardless of mood or circumstance. Ordinary time demanded reliability more than inspiration. This way of living shaped how people understood change. Environmental shifts were not sudden disasters, they were gradual adjustments, noticed through patterns. Slightly lower yields, longer dry periods, slower regrowth of resources. Decisions were made cautiously because consequences unfolded slowly. Ordinary time encouraged observation rather than reaction. It rewarded patience and penalized impulsiveness. These habits allowed the society to persist far longer than dramatic solutions ever could. The cliffs also show how ordinary time ends. There was no final day marked with significance. People left in stages. Some routines stopped earlier than others. Ceremonial spaces were used less frequently before being abandoned altogether. Daily life thinned gradually. Ordinary time did not break, it transitioned. The same attention that once sustained the cliffs redirected elsewhere. Time continued, simply in a different place. For modern observers, this lesson can feel unfamiliar. Contemporary life often fragments time into milestones and highlights. We measure progress through visible change. The cliff dwellings suggest another approach, valuing continuity over novelty. Stability was not boring to the ancestral Puebloans, it was essential. Their lives demonstrate that endurance depends less on innovation than on the reliable repetition of what works. Even today, standing in these dwellings, one senses this different relationship with time. The absence of urgency is striking. Nothing pushes the visitor forward. The space encourages stillness. It invites attention to small details rather than large conclusions. In this environment, time feels less linear and more layered, accumulated rather than spent. The cliffs teach that most human achievement is not built through extraordinary effort, but through ordinary actions sustained over long periods. History remembers outcomes, but the cliffs preserve process. They show how lives are shaped not by isolated decisions, but by habits maintained quietly and consistently. This perspective does not diminish human achievement, it grounds it. In the end, the ancestral Puebloans offer a simple but profound lesson about time. Life is not defined by the moments that stand out, but the ones that repeat.
Meaning accumulates slowly. Survival depends on attention, patience, and endurance. The cliffs remain because they were built and maintained within this understanding. They stand as reminders that ordinary human time, steady, repetitive, and quiet, is not empty. It is where history actually happens.
Part 19. Why quiet histories matter more than loud ones. History is often remembered through noise. Wars, declarations, discoveries, and collapses dominate textbooks and popular narratives. These events create clear markers, before and after, victory and defeat, rise and fall. Yet this emphasis on loud moments hides a deeper truth. Most human life unfolds far from these events. It unfolds in routine, repetition, and adaptation. Quiet histories, like that of the Ancestral Puebloans, reveal how societies actually endure. The cliff dwellings represent a history without spectacle. There were no conquering armies marching through the Southwest, no written laws etched into stone, no rulers issuing commands. Instead, there was cooperation, maintenance, and shared responsibility. These elements do not create dramatic scenes, but they sustain life over long periods. The absence of loud history is not a gap, it is a record of stability. Quiet histories matter because they show what happens between crises. They document how people live when survival depends not on extraordinary effort, but on consistent behavior. The ancestral Puebloans did not need to reinvent their society each generation. They refined it. Small improvements accumulated. Mistakes were corrected gradually. This process rarely leaves dramatic traces, but it leaves durable ones. Walls stand, terraces endure, patterns of use remain visible centuries later. Loud histories often exaggerate change. They compress complex processes into single moments. Quiet histories resist this compression. They demand patience from those who study them. Understanding emerges slowly through observation of detail rather than dramatic turning points. This is why the cliffs can feel unsatisfying to those seeking excitement. They do not reward quick conclusions. They require sustained attention. The focus on quiet history also challenges modern ideas of progress. We often assume that visible change equals improvement. The ancestral Puebloans remind us that continuity can be a success. Their society did not expand endlessly or innovate constantly. It maintained a balance that worked within environmental limits. This kind of success leaves fewer dramatic markers, but it produces longevity. Quiet histories preserve this perspective, offering a counterpoint to narratives driven by expansion and disruption. Another reason quiet histories matter is that they are more inclusive. Loud histories often center on elites, leaders, or singular events. Quiet histories center on ordinary people. Everyone in the cliff communities contributed: farmers, builders, children, elders. The archaeological record reflects collective effort rather than individual achievement. Grinding stones do not bear names. Repaired walls do not credit specific hands, yet these anonymous contributions sustained the entire society. The endurance of the cliff dwellings themselves reinforces this lesson. They were not built to impress future generations. They were built to solve immediate problems. Their survival is incidental, not intentional. This makes them honest historical records. They show what people valued when no one was watching. Quiet histories preserve this honesty because they are not shaped by self-presentation or propaganda. In modern life, noise often feels unavoidable. Information arrives constantly, change is rapid and visible. In this environment, quiet histories offer grounding. They remind us that endurance depends on stability more than speed, that adaptation is often gradual rather than revolutionary, that leaving a place can be as thoughtful as building it. These insights are easy to overlook without examples like the ancestral Puebloans. The cliffs teach that silence does not mean insignificance. Absence of drama does not mean absence of meaning.
Quiet histories reveal the structures beneath visible events. They show how societies manage resources, organize labor, and transmit knowledge without fanfare. These are the systems that determine whether communities survive beyond moments of crisis. Ultimately, quiet histories matter because they resemble our own lives. Most days are not dramatic, most decisions are small, yet over time, these small choices accumulate into outcomes that shape the future. The ancestral Puebloans understood this implicitly. They built a society around repetition, cooperation, and attention to limits. Their story remains because it was not loud, but because it worked. The cliff dwellings stand as proof that history does not need to shout to be significant. Sometimes the most important stories speak softly through stone, routine, and the long patience of time. Quiet histories do not demand attention, they wait, and for those willing to listen carefully, they offer lessons that loud histories often miss. At the end of this story, nothing closes dramatically. There is no final scene, no decisive moment, no single truth revealed. The cliffs remain where they have always been. Stone still rests on stone. Wind still moves through doorways that once framed daily life. The story ends not because something stops, but because there is nothing left that needs explaining. Everything essential has already happened. The ancestral Puebloans did not leave behind a message for the future. They did not intend to be remembered. They intended to live well enough, long enough, and wisely enough to survive their present. That intention shaped every decision they made: where to build, when to plant, how much to store, when to repair, when to move on. These decisions were not dramatic, they were careful. Over centuries, that care became their legacy. The cliffs do not ask for interpretation. They do not demand admiration. They simply exist as evidence of a life lived within limits. Their walls reflect a refusal to rush. Their layouts reveal cooperation rather than hierarchy. Their abandonment shows restraint rather than desperation. The story they tell is consistent from beginning to end. Human life, when sustained thoughtfully, does not need spectacle to endure. Modern viewers often search for meaning in conclusions. We want lessons summarized, emotions resolved, history neatly contained. The cliffs resist this impulse. They offer no final statement. They leave space. That space invites reflection rather than explanation. It allows each observer to notice something different: effort, patience, silence, endurance. None of these are imposed. They emerge naturally from attention. What makes this ending complete is its ordinariness. The people who lived in the cliffs did not experience their lives as history, they experienced them as responsibility. Each generation inherited unfinished work and passed it forward slightly improved or slightly worn. Over time, this accumulation reached a point where continuing in place no longer made sense. Leaving was not dramatic, it was reasonable, and so they left. After that, time continued doing what it always does. Memories softened, structures weathered, meanings shifted, new lives filled new spaces. Yet the cliffs remained, holding the outline of choices made long ago. They became quiet teachers, offering lessons without instruction. They did not explain how to live, they showed how life had been lived. This is where the USA boring history style finds its strongest expression. The value of this story lies not in excitement, but in accuracy. Most of human existence looks like this: slow, repetitive, thoughtful, constrained. The ancestral Puebloans were not exceptions to history, they were its most typical representatives. That is why their story matters. In saying goodbye to the cliffs, we are not closing a chapter of tragedy or triumph, we are acknowledging continuity. The people moved on. The land adapted. Time passed. Nothing went wrong. Nothing needed to be saved. Something simply reached its natural conclusion and transformed quietly into something else. The cliffs remain open to the sky, unoccupied but not abandoned. They are finished but not empty. Their silence is complete.
And in that silence, the story rests, unchanging, patient, and available to anyone willing to slow down enough to notice it. This is not the end of history. It is the end of telling this one story. The cliffs do not need more words. They have already lasted longer than most explanations ever will.
Part 21. After the ending. When the story is already over. After a story ends, something remains. Not action, not resolution, but awareness. The cliff dwellings exist in this state. They are no longer part of a living narrative, yet they are not disconnected from the present. They occupy a space where history has finished speaking, but has not been forgotten. This is where boring history often lives, not in conclusions, but in what lingers after them. Once the ancestral Puebloans left, the cliffs did not change roles immediately. For a long time, they were simply empty structures. No meaning was assigned, no interpretation was required. They were not monuments, they were not ruins in the dramatic sense. They were unused spaces shaped by past necessity. This period, stretching across centuries, is rarely discussed because nothing appears to happen. Yet, this is precisely why it matters. History often focuses on moments of transition, the moment people arrive, the moment they leave. What comes between those moments is emphasized. What comes after is usually ignored. But the cliffs spent far more time being empty than they ever spent being inhabited. This long duration of silence is part of their story. It shows how quickly human presence fades and how slowly physical evidence follows. During this time, the land absorbed the essence. Stone remained stable, wood decayed, paths softened, vegetation adjusted. These changes were not responses to human decisions, they were responses to the lack of them. The cliffs entered a phase governed entirely by natural processes. In this sense, the end of human activity did not conclude the story, it simply changed its author. When modern observers eventually arrived, they encountered a place already finished. The story had concluded without witnesses. Interpretation came later. Meaning was applied after the fact. This distance shapes how the cliffs are understood today. We see intention, planning, and adaptation because those elements survived. We do not see hesitation, doubt, or fatigue because those do not fossilize. What remains is structure, not emotion. This creates a particular kind of historical humility. The cliffs remind us that most lives conclude without summary. There is no final accounting, no explanation preserved for outsiders. People live, adapt, decide, and move on. What remains is partial, incomplete, yet sufficient. The ancestral Puebloans did not leave answers, they left evidence. Quiet histories like this teach us how to sit with that incompleteness. They do not resolve ambiguity, they accept it. The absence of explanation becomes part of the lesson. It reminds us that understanding the past does not require total clarity. It requires attention, restraint, and a willingness to accept limits. In modern storytelling, endings are expected to provide closure. This epilogue exists to do the opposite. It acknowledges that closure is often artificial. The real world does not stop when a chapter ends. Time continues. Places persist. Meanings shift. The cliffs did not know they were at the end of a story. They simply existed before, during, and after human presence. This perspective aligns perfectly with the boring history tradition. It resists emotional payoff. It avoids dramatic framing. It leaves the listener with a quiet recognition rather than a conclusion. The value lies not in what is said last, but in what is allowed to remain unsaid. After the ending, the cliffs still stand. After the story, time still passes. And after listening, nothing is required. No reaction, no judgment, just awareness. That is enough.
Part 22. When the past stops being strange.
There is a moment, often unnoticed, when the past stops feeling strange. At first, places like the cliff dwellings appear distant, unfamiliar, even mysterious. Visitors speak softly, move carefully, and search for explanations. But after time passes, minutes, hours, or repeated visits, something changes. The unfamiliar becomes ordinary. The cliffs begin to feel less like a historical subject and more like a place that once simply functioned. This shift matters. It marks the point where history stops being spectacle and starts becoming relatable. The rooms no longer feel small because they are ancient. They feel small because people lived efficiently. The low doorways stop being curiosities and start feeling practical. Storage rooms stop appearing symbolic and begin to look like what they were, solutions to everyday problems. The past loses its distance when we recognize it as routine rather than exception. The ancestral Puebloans become easier to understand at this stage, not because we learn new facts, but because we stop expecting difference. We stop assuming that their lives must have been defined by mystery or ritual alone. Instead, we begin to see the ordinary structure of their days: wake, work, maintain, prepare, rest. This recognition dissolves the sense that the past is fundamentally foreign. It reveals continuity rather than contrast. Quiet history plays a critical role here. Loud history keeps the past strange by emphasizing extremes. Quiet history does the opposite. It normalizes the past. It shows that people lived with the same constraints humans always have: limited time, limited energy, limited resources. The cliff dwellings are powerful, not because they are exotic, but because they are familiar once attention settles. As this familiarity grows, interpretation changes. Visitors ask fewer questions about why people live this way and more about how. How did they organize labor? How did they manage fatigue? How did they decide what was worth maintaining and what could be left behind? These are not romantic questions, they are practical ones. They reflect a shift from curiosity to comprehension. This stage of understanding is subtle and easily overlooked. It does not produce excitement, it produces calm recognition. The past stops demanding explanation and starts offering perspective. The cliffs no longer feel like remnants of a lost world, they feel like extensions of a world that never truly disappeared. Over time, this familiarity reshapes how we think about history itself. We stop seeing it as a collection of unusual events and start seeing it as accumulated normality. Most of what shaped the present did so quietly, through repetition, through maintenance, through decisions that were never meant to be remembered. The ancestral Puebloans did not intend to be instructive, yet their ordinary choices became lessons simply by lasting. When the past stops being strange, it also stops being distant. It enters the present as context rather than content. The cliffs no longer ask to be interpreted, they invite comparison. They encourage reflection on how we organize our own lives, how we use space, how we manage resources, and how we decide when to continue or change course. This is not nostalgia, it is recognition. The past is not idealized or judged, it is acknowledged as functional. And in that acknowledgement, it becomes relevant without needing to be dramatic. In the end, this may be the quietest lesson of all. History does not need to remain strange to be meaningful. Sometimes its greatest value appears only after it becomes ordinary again. When the ancestral Puebloans stop feeling like historical figures and start feeling like people who simply lived carefully, the story completes another cycle, not with an ending, but with understanding. Part 23. Living carefully is not a lost skill. One of the quietest lessons of the ancestral Puebloans is that living carefully is not extraordinary. It does not appear on monuments or in textbooks. It does not make headlines. Yet it determines whether a community endures or disappears. The cliff dwellings demonstrate this clearly. Every wall repaired, every terrace maintained, every grain of corn stored with attention was an act of deliberate care. Over centuries, these ordinary acts accumulated into survival. This careful living was not dramatic.
Children did not receive special instruction. Labor was not celebrated in ceremonies. People simply performed necessary tasks repeatedly, reliably, and with awareness. The success of the community did not depend on boldness or heroism. It depended on consistency, patience, and observation. The cliffs themselves remain because these small, careful actions were sustained over long periods of time. Modern society often undervalues careful living. Rapid decisions, immediate gratification, and visible achievement are prioritized. The past of the ancestral Puebloans challenges this mindset. Their survival was slow, methodical, and disciplined. Efficiency was measured not by speed, but by durability. Comfort was measured not by abundance, but by the absence of waste. Social success was measured not by status, but by cooperation and shared responsibility. These criteria may feel mundane, but they were remarkably effective. Attention to limits was central. Water was scarce, wood was finite, arable land was precious. The people recognized boundaries and organized life within them. They did not ignore scarcity, nor did they assume endless resources. Their careful choices, repeated daily, allowed their society to thrive for generations. Modern observers often marvel at architecture or agriculture, but these are visible outcomes of invisible habits: caution, observation, and patience. Living carefully also included knowing when to leave. Abandonment of the cliffs was not panic or failure, it was reasoned judgment. When environmental and social pressures accumulated to a point that living there could no longer be sustained, relocation was the choice. This decision required awareness, foresight, and discipline, the same traits that had allowed the society to persist for centuries. Ending something gracefully is itself an aspect of careful living. The practice of careful living extended to social life. Cooperation was not optional. Labor, resources, and knowledge were shared. Kivas functioned as centers for cultural continuity and social coordination. Every act reinforced the systems that supported the community. Even minor neglect could have cascading consequences. Survival was not luck, it was attention, repeated consistently over time. What remains today, the walls, terraces, and silent kivas reflect these patterns. The cliffs speak quietly, not of heroics, but of everyday diligence. Visitors who observe closely can reconstruct the rhythm of life: small steps, careful choices, repeated actions. The story emphasizes process over outcome, continuity over climax. It is a history without spectacle, yet its lessons remain enduring. This is why living carefully is not a lost skill. The ancestral Puebloans demonstrate that deliberate attention to small details is as significant as any dramatic achievement. Their story, told in stone, labor, and routine, reminds us that what is often dismissed as mundane may in fact be the most important factor in longevity, resilience, and survival. Ultimately, the cliffs invite reflection on how we live today. We may not face scarcity in the same way, but the principle remains. Attention, patience, cooperation, and thoughtful choices shape the outcomes of our lives. Ordinary acts, maintained over time, create the foundation upon which societies endure. The past becomes relevant not through spectacle, but through the quiet wisdom it offers. In observing the cliffs, the visitor realizes that careful living is not exceptional. It is ordinary life carried out deliberately. The ancestral Puebloans did not seek recognition. They did not intend to teach lessons. Yet their legacy endures precisely because they lived carefully. The cliffs are the silent record of that truth. Survival is built on ordinary actions, repeated steadily over generations in quiet awareness. Part 24. Why silence often speaks louder than words. There is a peculiar kind of history that speaks without making a sound. The cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans are an example of this phenomenon. No inscriptions, no proclamations, no public records accompany them. Yet their walls, terraces, and worn pathways communicate more than many written accounts. The lesson they convey is subtle, often overlooked. Silence can preserve meaning longer than words, and careful action often resonates further than speech. Walking among these cliffs, one notices absence first. There are no voices calling from the past, no stories being recited. Only the arrangement of rooms, the patterns of storage, the alignment of terraces remain. This absence initially feels like emptiness, yet the emptiness is instructive. It emphasizes structure over drama, function over performance. The lack of spoken history forces the observer to attend to what is left, the quiet traces of effort, attention, and routine. Silence carries its own weight because it allows observation without interference. No interpretation is imposed, no dramatic narrative demands attention. Instead, the viewer or listener must engage actively, noticing small details, the wear on steps from repeated passage, the smooth edges of grinding stones, the careful positioning of ventilation openings in kivas. Each feature is evidence of deliberate human activity. Taken together, these silent clues reveal the rhythm and priorities of daily life. This is why silence often speaks louder than words. A single written account might exaggerate or misrepresent, it might glorify leaders or events. The cliffs, by contrast, remain truthful in their quiet. They do not embellish, they do not lie. Every wall repaired, every storage room used, every terrace maintained over generations stands as proof of consistent care. Their silence communicates process more clearly than words ever could. Moreover, silence encourages reflection. Visitors and historians alike are invited to slow down. They are forced to consider the patterns of life without immediate narrative gratification. One notices how tasks repeated over decades sustain societies, how cooperation underpins survival, and how careful observation of limits prevents collapse. This reflection, born of quiet attention, is more enduring than any dramatic tale. It resonates precisely because it requires engagement rather than passive consumption. The ancestral Puebloans understood, consciously or not, that meaningful action does not need an audience. Daily work, repeated reliably, was sufficient to sustain generations. Lessons were conveyed through example rather than instruction. Silence was a medium of education and memory. The structures themselves became the record keepers of knowledge. Over time, this form of communication proved far more durable than spoken stories or written proclamations. The cliffs also demonstrate that absence is not failure. Where voices are missing, meaning persists. Where people have gone, structure remains. Where events were unrecorded, process speaks. Silence becomes an enduring witness to life, decision, and care. The ancestral Puebloans did not need to explain themselves. Their actions were sufficient, and for those willing to listen, their quiet story resonates across centuries. In this way, the silent cliff dwellings convey lessons louder than any shouted account could. They teach that durability arises from attention, consistency, and restraint. They remind us that history often matters most in the spaces between words, in the moments when nothing is said but everything is done. The cliffs endure because silence preserves truth better than noise, and because careful, deliberate living leaves marks that words could never match.
Part 25. The final reflection. Time, patience, and endurance. As the story of the ancestral Puebloans draws to a close, there is no climactic event, no moment of triumph, no catastrophe, no dramatic revelation. The cliffs remain as they always have, quiet, stable, and enduring. The lesson of this final part is not found in a single occurrence, but in the totality of existence across centuries, the slow accumulation of effort, the patient management of life, and the endurance of choices made carefully over time.
This is the essence of boring history, the quiet, repetitive work that sustains civilizations. Time itself becomes a character in this reflection. The lives of those who built the cliffs unfolded in daily increments. Each sunrise brought repetition, fetching water, tending crops, repairing walls, preparing food, maintaining tools. These tasks were ordinary and expected, yet their repetition over decades created stability. Time was measured not in celebrations or crises, but in the steady persistence of routine. The cliffs endure because time was respected and work was maintained consistently. Patience emerges as the second lesson. It was not enough to act correctly once. Survival required continuous care. When walls cracked, they were mended again and again. When terraces eroded, they were rebuilt methodically. The pace of life was slow, deliberate, and attentive. The society depended on long-term thinking, not immediate gratification. This patience extended beyond physical labor. It shaped decisions about when to plant, when to harvest, when to leave, and when to stay. Life was guided by measured judgment rather than impulse. Endurance, both social and environmental, completes the trio of lessons. The ancestral Puebloans endured harsh conditions, arid climate, scarce resources, and challenging terrain. Their society endured through cooperation, shared responsibility, and the maintenance of communal systems. Endurance was not spectacular, it was quiet. It was built through countless ordinary actions performed consistently by many individuals over generations. This is what allowed their legacy to persist even after the cliffs were abandoned. The cliffs themselves testify to these lessons. Each room, each terrace, each worn step represents accumulated effort. The structures are not monuments to individual heroism. They are records of collective diligence, repeated carefully and patiently. Visitors and historians can trace this endurance in stone and earth. They do not need to imagine battles, disasters, or dramatic events. The history is visible in patterns, in repetition, and in continuity. It speaks in silence, and yet it speaks clearly. Reflecting on the cliffs, modern observers are reminded that history is often ordinary. The past is less a sequence of extraordinary events than a continuum of daily choices. Survival, progress, and adaptation are products of repeated, attentive actions. The dramatic, the loud, and the unusual capture attention, but the quiet, steady work shapes outcomes.